Okay, good morning. Bob says we're a couple of weeks late on this. We did the same thing after Sukkot. After Sukkot, we started the series about the bracha neshek b'sukkah. I recently heard a class from a Rav where he said that he got a Shiloh on Friday afternoon. I forget exactly what the Shiloh was, but it was something to do with the medical care of an animal over Shabbos. And he says there's a simon in Shulchan Aruch about it, but when you learn that simon, I don't delve into it too deeply because it never occurred to me that I would get a shaila about giving a dog an injection on Shabbos. So in today's class, we're also going to cover a topic which is an explicit halacha in Shulchan Aruch, and many people never learned it, and even those people who do learn it don't necessarily pay too much attention to it or remember it because it doesn't appear to ever be relevant. But also in the process, besides, of course, even we learn Torah, like we know, Rabbi talks about in Tanya, even if it's not practically relevant and it never will happen, it's still mitzvah learning Torah. And in addition, in the process, we'll discover a lot the structure of the mitzvah, hafrashas challah, etc. So a friend of mine told me, this is in honor of our friend from England. So an acquaintance went into Grodzinski's bakery in London. And apparently the bakeries, I don't know if the bakeries here do it, I'm not sure what the point of this is, but apparently this is a thing, that you could come in on Friday afternoon, you could come in on Friday and purchase dough to take home and make your own challah with it. Yeah. So somebody walks into the bakery and he wants to buy dough, and of course the people working at the bakery are not Jewish, and he sees how they go to the back and they have this huge mixing bowl, and there's a fresh dough just finished being made, and they give him whatever he ordered, the pound of dough, and they give him his dough, and that's it. And this person has now discovered the scandal of all scandals. What's going on over here? The non-Jewish workers in the bakery are giving him dough without being mafresh challah, without separating challah from the dough. He saw the dough finish. He saw them give it to him. What's going on? So he calls the Rapoport, he calls the kashrus agency that certifies this bakery, and he tells them what happened. And they said, "What's the problem?" The halacha is oichel u'meshayir. The halacha is that in Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, when you make dough or when you bake challah, you don't have to separate the challah before you eat the challah. You can bake the dough, you can eat the challah, and as long as you make sure that before you finish devouring it, you leave over a piece of challah or a piece of dough, and I'm sorry, I skipped that one part of the story. He said before he called the hechsher, he asked the non-Jew serving him that he didn't take challah. So they said, "Oh, the rabbi comes in later to do it," which is indeed the halacha. And outside of Eretz Yisrael, what is strictly speaking, we'll see soon why it's not the practice to do so usually. But you can leave over and be mafresh challah at the end, and there's different ways of understanding the mechanism, whether it retroactively works, that it's as if you were mafresh challah at the beginning, or whether or there's no mitzvah taken at the beginning. We'll discuss all of this soon. So this is the halacha of oichel u'meshayir. Now there is a prohibition. So in practice, we all know that it's the custom of the halacha. Again, we're going to discuss all these things in detail. That we separate the challah before we eat the challah and before we bake the dough. However, when this becomes, do you happen to know what the CRC policy is about oichel u'meshayir?
All I know is that I take challah from dough that they make a certain amount. That's all that.
Are they marked with that nobody should use anything from the dough before you were mafresh challah?
They want me to do it before.
Right. Okay. Anyway, so
I don't know how it's like in the bakery, because the bakery they don't have
mashkiach, right? The mashkiach shallot have mashkiach. Okay. Anyway, so but when this halacha becomes very relevant is on Shabbos. If on Shabbos there's a prohibition, you're not allowed to separate challah on Shabbos, as we will see. So how do I, one second, with pen. So if a person remembered on Shabbos that they forgot to be mafresh challah before Shabbos, so then they can continue eating that meal as long as they leave over some challah, and after Shabbos then can be mafresh challah. This is a halacha that comes up. It comes up. It's actually just a few months ago. I had somebody knock on my door Friday night that they forgot to be mafresh challah, and I told them no problem, continue eating, just leave over some for after Shabbos, and you'll be mafresh challah after Shabbos. So here comes the exciting story. This is a true story. It happened here to a friend of mine right here in the community. This year was Shabbos Erev Pesach, and for Shabbos Erev Pesach you need to have chametz challah for the Friday night meal, for the Shabbos day meal. And he's a big family, and he had relatives staying over for Pesach, and there were a lot of people. And I don't know exactly when this happened, but at some point they went to the store to buy challah for Shabbos, and all the stores were sold out. And so they have to bake challah. But now they did have the option of using egg matzah, but that's not a very convenient option because you really have to eat a lot of it. You basically have to eat about 4 matzahs for each meal. I mean, it's a huge amount that you have to eat in order to be able to wash and make hametz on it, according to all opinions. So the missus goes down to the basement and she finds a bowl and this and that, and she makes a chametz dough in her basement. And then her husband takes this chametz dough to, I believe it was his parents' house, who are out of town for Pesach, so their chametz kitchen was still usable. And he baked the challah over there, and they brought it home. They had enough bulkalach for everyone to have a bulkala on Friday night and a bulkala on Shabbos day, and everything was all good. Come home Friday night, and suddenly they realize that because of this unusual, they baked it here, they forgot to be mafresh challah. So he's like, okay, no problem. We all know this is the halacha. So he put one of the bulkalach in the freezer, in the chametz freezer, and he says, okay, this is with the sold chametz. And after Pesach, we'll be mafresh challah from it, and we're good to go. And indeed, they make kiddush and start eating the meal. And then he realizes that, hold on a second, the chametz was already sold on Friday afternoon. And the chametz that I leave out for Shabbos, now I actually don't know if in this particular story, at what point did he bake the challah on Friday afternoon after the sale? I'm not sure. We'll discuss. I believe that this is going to be a 2-part class. It'll just take two classes to cover all the material. And I think in next class, we'll discuss the various different options of the different ways that rabbis sell the chametz in a year when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, and whether there would have been different workarounds had he, depending on which method the rabbi used. But in this particular case, it was here in Chicago. He sold this chametz with Rabbi Hertz. Rabbi Hertz sold the chametz before Shabbos, and it was any chametz that you leave out for Shabbos is not included in the sale, and it's your responsibility to make sure to destroy it before the time of destroying chametz on Shabbos, late Shabbos morning. So here they are, they're in the middle of the meal, they finished eating the challah, and the challah is in the freezer, but it's not included in the sale, so they're stuck. So what do you do? Now, what in fact he did, spoiler alert, what in fact he did was, after some research, was that he was mafresh challah on Shabbos. He separated the challah on Shabbos, and he gave it to a Cohen to eat. It happened to be that his brother-in-law who was staying with him was a Cohen, and he gave it specifically to a Cohen below the age of 9, his nephew, and his nephew ate it. That's what he did. And what I would like to do over the course of today and next week is to give an overview of the sugya of the halachas of Rosh Challah, and to hopefully determine whether or not what he did was the correct option. Could there have been any other workarounds and any other solutions to this issue? And Hashem should help. It should be halacha v'lo l'maisa, because nobody should ever forget to be mafresh challah again. Okay. So the pasuk says, and here we're going to share the screen. The pasuk says in Parsha Shlach, Daber b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, and you should say to them, "B'vayachem ha'aretz," when you come into the land, Asher ani mevi eschem shama, which I am bringing you to. When you eat from the bread of the land, Torima teruma laHashem, you should separate a teruma la Hashem. It's important to remember that the word challah, which we use to be master, you separate challah, you call it challah, but the Torah refers to it with the word teruma, which usually when we say teruma, we're referring to the first of the tithes that is taken from raw produce, from the raw crop. But the challah is also referred to by the Torah with the word teruma. What is this teruma? Reishis in the beginning of your dough, challah torimu la Hashem, you must be given as challah to Hashem, kisruma as goren, just like the truma from your crop, kin teruma isa. Now here it's explicit in the Torah that it has to be reishis harisei the beginning of your dough, the first of your dough, and that is in halachic terminology that means that challah is teveles, the dough. In other words, that before you have separated challah, the dough is tevel. It is forbidden to eat the dough before you are mafresh challah. Earlier we said about that you can eat the dough and be mafresh challah later. That's only in the diaspora. But here we're talking about the voyachim of the arts when you come into the land and when you eat from the bread of the land. When you have a dough in Eretz Yisrael, it is explicit in the Torah, and that one may not eat this dough before mafresh challah, and if you are, it is the prohibition of tevel, which is a very severe prohibition. However, this, like we just said, this is only applies in Israel. The mitzvah to be mafresh challah only applies in Eretz Yisrael, and additionally, it only applies when Kol Yisrael al Admasam, when the entire Jewish people are in Israel. Let's see how the Rambam says this in the laws of Bikurim, chapter Hey, halacha Hey. According to scriptural law, we are only obligated to separate challah in Eretz Yisrael, as it states, when you partake of the bread of the land. And only when the entire Jewish people are located there, as it states, when you enter, right? When you enter, i.e. when you all enter, and not only when a portion of you enter. For this reason, in the present era, and even in the era of Ezra in Eretz Yisrael, the observance of Challah is only a rabbinic decree. In other words, like this: when Joshua took the Jewish people into the land, the entire Jewish people came, and then there was a biblical obligation to be mafresh challah. With the second Commonwealth, when Ezra came up from Bavel to Israel, so most of the Jewish people, or many of the Jewish people, remained in Bavel, and so from after the destruction of the first temple until today, there has never been a time when Hafrashas Challah, when separating Challah, was biblical, even in Israel till this very day. And even the entire duration of the second temple, which is called Bias Ezra, there was no biblical obligation to separate Challah in Israel. And even though the Gemara actually records a story over here, which I did not put in the English, okay, we'll just read the story because it may come up again soon, that Rav Huna, the son of Rabbi Shua, met the rabbis, the Rabbanon de Beirav, the Talmidim of Rav, who were sitting and saying that Challah nowadays is the Eraisa. And I said to them, no, that Challah nowadays is only the Rabbanon. However, even though nowadays Challah, even in Israel, is only the Rabbanon, is only a rabbinic decree, nevertheless, the laws that pertain to Challah in Israel are much more strict as they are as they pertain to Challah in the diaspora, because in Eretz Yisrael it's called Ikra min HaTorah. That means that it's at the root, the basis, the root is something which is a biblical mitzvah. It happens to be that today we're missing a requirement, namely the requirement that all of the Jewish people live in Israel, so therefore it's only rabbinic in nature today. But because it's Ikra min HaTorah, because essentially there is a biblical mitzvah to be mafresh Challah in Eretz Yisrael, we are much more strict about the halachas of Challah in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the sages instituted that we should be mafresh Challah in Chutz La'aretz as well, even outside of Eretz Yisrael. And the reason is, well, we'll see. There's a couple of reasons. Let's read the way the Rambam codifies this, and then we'll discuss. So this is the Rambam in the same chapter, Bikurim, chapter 5, halacha 8, and let's read it in English. There are three different sets. This is basically paraphrasing the Mishnah in Masechtas Challah. shalosh arotzos l'chala. There are three different sets of laws that apply to Challah in three different lands. In the entire area, so basically there's the Oile Bavel, there's the land of Israel that was captured, that was conquered by the Oile Bavel, that Ezra, when they came back from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael that they captured, and the Eretz Yisrael that they captured is smaller than the original land of Israel, which Joshua conquered. But we're not going to get into all the details of this now. There's the whole question of Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shniya, whether or not the Kedusha Rishona, the original sanctification of the land that was accomplished by Yehoshua, the land retained its sanctity, or when they left Israel to Bavel, did that sanctity of the land become deactivated and was reactivated by Ezra, and therefore only those portions of the land that Ezra conquered are considered part of Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, we have Shalosh Arotzos L'Chala. We have the smaller part of Israel that was conquered by Ezra. We then have the bigger section, which includes, which we'll see some, includes the bigger area of Israel that was conquered by what's called the Olam Mitzrayim by Joshua, but not by the Olam Bavel. And then we have outside of that. Now the truth is that even outside of that, there is a machlokas between the Rambam and Tosfos, whether the whole diaspora is the same, or if there's a difference between those the parts of the diaspora that are close to Israel versus the parts that are far from Israel. And it's unclear exactly what close and far means. I mean, clearly Chicago would be far, but is Turkey close? Is Turkey far? Where do you exactly draw the line? But we're not going to get into that in our class. We're just going to talk about Shalosh Arotzos L'Chala. We're actually primarily going to talk about Israel and the diaspora. Okay. There are three different sets of laws that apply to Challah in three different lands. In the entire area that was settled by those who returned from Bavel until Kaziv, one Challah should be separated according to the appropriate measure, and the priests may partake of it. So you mafresh Challah, and the priests may partake of it. In the remaining portions of Eretz Yisrael that was settled by the Jews who came out of Egypt, but not by those who returned from Bavel, i.e. from Kaziva till Almana, two Challahs should be separated. One should be burnt and one should be eaten. So what the Rambam is saying is like this. You have the land of Israel itself, where you just do the simple mitzvah in the Torah, you separate the challah from the dough, and you give it to a Cohen to eat. In order for the Cohen to eat it, the Cohen has to be pure. Now, there are numerous different types of impurity, some of them we're reading in the Torah these days, that could affect the Cohen, and he has to, as long as the Cohen is not contaminated by any of those forms of impurity, he may eat challah. Basically, it would mean coming tumas meis, having come in contact or being under the same roof as a dead body, or additionally, there are numerous bodily emissions that could make a Kohen Tameh, which we'll get into more detail soon, but let's just talk about a seminal emission for a man that could make a Kohen impure. Or and the third type is if he came in contact with a dead animal or a dead sheretz, a lizard or something like that. That's three generic types of impurity. Provided that the Kohen has purified himself from any of those three, which in the latter two cases, meaning having contact with a dead animal or with a bodily emission, it just requires going to mikveh and waiting until nightfall after going to mikveh. And in the case of coming in contact with a dead body, with a corpse, that requires the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer. So you have to take care of that, and then the Kohen can partake in the cham. Now, there is a concept called Tumas Eretz Ha'amim. That means that any area of land, any part of the world outside of Israel, the Chachamim decreed that it be considered automatically impure. We're not going to get into all the reasons for that right now. Now, because the part of Israel that was, the bigger part of Israel, the part that was originally conquered by the Jews who came out of Egypt, but was not conquered by those who returned from Bavel, so that is also included in the Tumas Eretz Ha'amim. impurity because it's outside of Israel, because it wasn't conquered by Israel. But we're very sensitive about it because people consider it Israel, so people don't realize that it's impure, right? It's kind of a little bit like Eilat's today, which halachically, according to the vast majority of opinions, is not part of the borders of the land, is not included within the borders of Israel, but everybody considers Eilat to be Israel. So it seems like that was a similar thing there, that halachically, this area was contaminated by Tumas Eretz Amim. It was included in the decree of the Chachamim that anywhere outside of Israel is considered impure. And therefore, you can't eat the challah that you separate the challah, but you can't eat it because everybody's impure. The challah is impure, the Cohen, everything's impure. So you can't eat it. But the problem is people don't realize that. People think it's Israel. So what are you going to do? You're going to separate the challah and you're going to burn it. But so people will think that you just took challah and burnt it. You're not allowed to just burn challah if it's pure, and only if it's impure you're allowed to burn it. You're not allowed to just take challah and burn it. So therefore the Chacham instituted that in that section of Israel, you should take a second challah. The first challah you burn, the second challah you give to the Cohen, and then people will think about this and they'll inquire and they'll say, what's going on over here? Why are you giving one to the Cohen? Why are you burning the first one? And then they will learn that indeed the reason why it was burnt was not because you may just separate challah and burn it with no impurity, but only because this part of Israel is included within the decree of Tumas Eretz Amim. That's the normative way of explaining it. Other Rishonim explain it a little bit differently, not that that section of land inherently is impure, but because it's so close, I guess, geographically and possibly socially, to places which are indeed in Chutz La'aretz, and there's a lot of travel to and fro, it would be impossible to reasonably expect people to be able to protect the challah that they take there from coming in contact with Tumas Eretz Amim. So you're in Syria, which is part of, let's say, I believe Syria is part of Syria. Yeah, I think it's what we call it. I think I don't know exactly the geography, but I'm pretty sure Syria is part of, or at least parts of Syria are included in that part of Israel. So you take challah, and let's even say there's no Tumas Eretz Amim, but it's right next to your neighbor, and he's going to come in with Tumas Eretz Amim and contaminate the dough. So because we can't avoid that, Chachamim said you have to burn the challah. But because we don't want people to make a mistake and think that you could just burn challah with no valid reason, they instituted to take a second challah, which you do give to a Cohen, and that way people realize that there's something more going on here and they learn about it. Okay? Let's see that in the Rambam. Why do we separate two challahs there? Because the first challah is impure because this land was not sanctified in the time of Ezra, and the first sanctification, namely the sanctification of the land, which was done by Joshua, was nullified after the Jews were exiled. But nevertheless, since the land is from Israel, a challah, 1/48 of the dough, is separated and is burnt. We're not going to get into the numbers of the measurements of 48 to 24. Well, that's for another discussion. A second challah is also separated and given to a priest to eat, a kohen to eat, so that people will not say that pure teruma or pure challah, remember challah and teruma can be synonymous, should be burnt. For the first challah was burnt even though it did not come in contract impurity in a manner that was known to all. So people will mistakenly think that it's permissible to burn teruma that did not become impure. And therefore the second challah, and therefore we take a second challah and give it to the Cohen to make to draw awareness to this situation. Okay, let's skip the next slide. In all the lands from Ammona and beyond, whether in Syria or in other lands, so basically anywhere else in the world, including Chicago, two challahs should be separated. When you bake a dough in Chicago, you have to separate two challahs. News to you, huh? Okay. One, don't worry, we'll clear up all the surprises soon. One of them is burnt, so that people should not say we saw impure teruma being eaten. And one is eaten so that the two challahs, the laws of challah, will not be forgotten by the Jewish people. So here we have the opposite problem. The truth is that Terumas Challas Chutz La'aretz, to separate Challah and Chutz La'aretz, is only a rabbinic decree, right? Because we said before, the Pasuk says explicitly you only have to separate Challah and Israel. Now, whereas in the areas of what he called from Kaziv to Lamona, people commonly did not realize that that area was included in the decree of Eretz Amim. So that's why, so people didn't know that it's Tamim. In Chicago, we have the opposite problem. In Chicago, everybody knows that Chicago is tummy. Everybody knows on two accounts. Everybody knows that Chicago is part of the diaspora and is thereby included in Tumas Eretz Amin. And at least nowadays, we have an additional factor that everybody knows that every one of us is Tamei Memes. We have all come either in a cemetery or under the same roof or in some contact that conveys Tuma of a corpse, and we no longer have access to the ashes of the Parah Aduma. So we're all Tamei Memes. So theoretically, you could separate only one challah in Chicago and give it to a Cohen. But because a Cohen would, because challah chutz la'aretz, challah of the diaspora, is permissible, theoretically is permissible to be eaten in a state of impurity. Because it's just challah chutz la'aretz. The problem is that people won't realize the difference between challah chutz la'aretz and challah Eretz Yisrael. And if you separate challah in Chicago and give it to a Kohen to eat, people will think, hey, I know this challah is impure. I know the Kohen is impure, and he ate it. So that means you're allowed to eat challah that's impure. And then they'll go to Israel and do the same thing. So therefore, you have to separate two. One of them is burnt, so that people should not say we saw impure truma being eaten. And one of them is eaten. Why do you have a different one to be eaten? You separate one, you burn it. Okay, so that's it, you're done. You separated challah, and it's impure, so you burnt it. Why do you have to separate a second one here in Chicago? So that the laws of challah will not be forgotten by the Jewish people. Because people will think, oh, challah is just burnt. They won't realize that, no, actually, challah is one of it's one of the 24 gifts that God gave to the Kohanim. People will think challah is just, like the story of, why do you cut off the ends of the fish and the ends of the meat? Because my bubby had a pot that was too small. People think, oh, there's a thing. You take off a piece of dough and put it in the fire and burn it. People won't realize that challah is actually a mitzvah to give to the Kohen, etc. And therefore, you have to take two challahs in Chicago. Now, since one second. Okay. Now,
who can eat the one that's eaten?
Oh, anyone that's a Cohen. Not it has to be a Cohen, not a non-Cohen, but it could be a Cohen with any type of impurity. Now, again, let's review the three types of impurity that we have over here. We have the impurity of coming in contact with a corpse, which that's included really in Tumas Eretz Amim. The Tumah of the diaspora is, I believe, associated with that. Then we have Tumah of a bodily emission. And then we have Tumah of coming in contact with an animal. So in Chutz La'aretz in Chicago, you have to separate two challahs. One of them you burn, one of them you give that the Cohen to eat. This challah can be eaten by a Cohen who has any of those three types of Tumah, no restrictions whatsoever. The only restriction is that it may not be eaten by a non-Cohen. When we say Cohen, it can mean a few things. It could mean either an adult Cohen, could mean a Cohen child, boy or girl, or could be the daughter, the unmarried daughter, never married daughter of a Cohen, and it could be the wife of a Cohen. And we'll see later, probably more next week, that it could even be an animal that belongs to a Cohen. So if a Cohen in Nishtagadat has a dog, so if a Cohen has a dog, so then he could feed his dog. I don't know, do dogs eat bread? Okay, so you can give it to the dog. However, there is a workaround. So again, in Chicago, you have to separate two challahs. One of them to be burned, one of them to give to a Cohen, and any Cohen can eat it. However, what if you only want to do one challah? You don't want to have to separate two challahs. So then the halacha is, again, in Chutz La'aretz, in Chicago, if you give it to a Cohen who is pure, who is not tamei, then you only need to do one. If you burn the first challah, then the second one can be given to a challah, to a Cohen, even if he has any type of impurity. But if you give if you do one and give it to a Cohen who is not tamei, who is tahar, then you don't need to have another one to burn it. So now, what time? How tahor does he have to be? Now, obviously, there's no requirements for him to be purified from tumas mace, because we don't have a paraduma, we don't have the red heifer, so that's not part of the equation. He has to go to mikveh now, or she. So there's what's called in halacha tuma hayotze olav migufin, a bodily tuma. So as far as a man is concerned, that could either be, okay, first of all, it could be mitzora. A mitzora, which is just in this week's parsha, is included in that, but practically speaking, that's not relevant nowadays, so we're not going to talk about that. For a male Cohen, it could be either a zav or a keri. Keri means a seminal emission. Now, zav is interesting. Zav, if anybody knows any more details about this, please speak up. Zav is described as similar to a seminal emission, but it was in yesterday's parsha. There are three characteristics that differentiate between a regular seminal emission and a zav. One is that seminal emission, a regular seminal emission is a healthy thing, and a zav is considered an anomaly, something unhealthy. Another is that the color of the substance that comes out is a different shade of white. And the third is that a regular keri seminal emission emerges from an erect organ, and a zav emission comes out from what we call in halacha a dead organ, from a non-erect organ. Now, I don't know the way when I was a kid I was told zav doesn't exist nowadays. I don't know. Again, I'm not. As far as I understand, zav does not exist nowadays, and we'll see soon in the halacha that most of the pasuk don't even talk about it. But there is one prominent sefer on the laws of Challah called the Challas Lechem, who was pre-war, important sefer, and he is very concerned with zav. Let's leave that aside for now. But basically, you have zav, for a man is concerned, you have a keri, a regular seminal emission, and possibly a zav as well. Now, how does one purify oneself from keri? You have to go to mikveh. When you go, a zav has a much more complicated process of purification, similar to a woman who has to count 7 clean days. A zav would also have to count 7 clean days. In addition, for a zav, a regular mikveh is not good enough. He must immerse in a mayon nachayim, in a spring, not in a well or in a mikveh. It has to be in a live spring. Okay, that's as far as an adult male is concerned. For a child male, halachically speaking, we say below the age of 9. Obviously, it's not relevant. Even though usually we say the average age of reaching puberty is 13 for a boy, and I think that practically speaking nowadays with all the hormones, it's a little bit less than that. But as far as this is concerned, we say a child below the age of 9 is considered not to have had a seminal emission. Now, it's very important to also to remember another important thing, that to become pure from a tumas keri, from a seminal emission, there's 2 things. You have to go to mikveh, and then you have to wait for nightfall. It's the first Mishnah in Shas. The Kohenim eat truma by night because they go to mikveh, and then they have to wait. Numerous psukim in the Torah. The sun sets, and the combination of going to mikveh and then waiting for sunset, that is easy for anything. Although when it comes to challah chutz laaretz, if for a Kohen to eat challah in chutz laaretz, he doesn't have to go to mikveh. He doesn't have to wait for sunset. Just going to mikveh, he's okay to eat it right away. Yes.
Are we permitted to ask the Cohen if he's told me?
Let's finish the. Now that's as far as a male Cohen is concerned. As far as a female Cohen is concerned, which is either the daughter of a Cohen or the unmarried daughter of a Cohen or the wife of a Cohen. So there are more possibilities. First of all, if she's nida, so then she has to go to mikveh. And there also, the Challas Lechem says that there's people who have learned Hilchos Nida will in depth will know that there's numerous mishnayos and laws in the recorded in Gemaras about Nida, which the Beis Yosef of the Torah will say that's for taharos. In other words, there are many laws that we don't keep nowadays because they don't pertain to Nida as far as the husband-wife relationship is concerned. They pertain to Nida as far as dealing with consecrated meats or to a holy, truma, karbanos, kodshim, etc. So The Chalas Lechem says that he's concerned about giving Challah to a Cohen, woman Cohen, because even though she knows all the laws to go to mikveh to allow herself to be permitted to her husband, she may not be familiar with the additional stringencies that apply to purifying herself and going to mikveh to be able to eat challah. So again, Chalas Lechem is very machmir about that. I'm not sure that other poskim would agree with that. Now, that's for a married woman. For a teenage girl, nowadays teenage girls don't go to mikveh. So once, I don't know exactly at what age it would be. I'm not sure if it says this anywhere, but at whatever age we could, a girl is assumed to have begun menstruating, she would be impure. But if you have a 3-year-old daughter of a Cohen, then technically she would also be allowed to eat truma. An additional form of impurity for a woman is yoledis, a woman who has given birth, is also impure. Usually that comes together with bleeding anyway, but is also impure. And another one which is relevant is piletas shechva zera. That means a woman who's had relations with her husband. So at some point there may be some discharge of her husband's semen from her. So within 72 hours after they've had relations, she has to wait those 72 hours and then go to mikveh again. Practically speaking, nowadays nobody does that. So basically, a woman would be allowed to eat the challah after she's gone to mikveh before she's had relations with her husband, which is not usually that practical or that much time. But so the most practical, we'll see more, maybe perhaps we'll see more details about this soon. But most practical, it's going to be male Cohen, either below the age of 9 or older than the 9 who has been to mikveh. Now, and again, so. And in Chutz La'aretz, in Chicago, you have to do 2 challahs, one to a Kohen, even a Kohen is completely impure, and one of them is burnt. Alternatively, you can do 1 challah and give it to a Kohen who has gone to mikveh, and even though he's still contaminated with tumas mes, he's just come from a funeral or anything else, and even he's been to mikveh, he's okay. Let's read that inside from Halacha Yud and Rambam. Although challah from the diaspora is impure, since its fundamental requirement is a rabbinic ordinance, it is forbidden to be eaten only by priests who are impure because of impurity that results from a physical condition. These include priests that have a seminal emission, zavim, zavis, nidus, women who give birth, people afflicted by tziras. Others who are impure because they have been in contact with other sources of impurity, even those who are impure because of contact with the corpse are permitted to partake of it. Accordingly, if there was a priest who was a minor in Chutz La'aretz, whether in Syria or anywhere else, and one desired to separate only 1 challah, he could separate 1/48 of the dough. It could be eaten by a priest. Again, I'm not getting into the numbers now for this class. It could be eaten by a priest who is a minor and who never had a seminal emission, or a female from the priestly family who has never menstruated. The person need not separate a second challah. Similarly, if a priest who was an adult immersed himself in the mikvah and thus purified himself from impurity resulting from the mission of semen or zivos, may partake in the first challah. So the word here mikvah is inaccurate because a mikvah would be good for a mission of semen, but a mikvah would not be good for a zivus. For a zivus, need to be table in a mayim. So this is not the words of the Rambam. This is in the brackets that was added in by the translator. This is an inaccurate word. Anyway, then the one who separated need not separate a second challah in the diaspora. This applies even though the sun has not set after he immersed himself, and although he remains ritually impure due to the impurity imparted by a corpse. Before we continue, let's look at the charts. So some of you, I gave you the printed chart, but I'm going to bring it up here on the screen. There we go. Oh, now I have to zoom out. I have to figure out how to do that. Hold on. Okay, so in Eretz Yisrael, which in the smaller part of the land, which was in the second by Ezra was conquered, you only separate 1 challah and you give it to a Kohen who must be 100% pure, including sprinkled by the ashes of the red heifer. In the western part over here of Eretz Yisrael, the eastern side of Eretz Yisrael, which was conquered by the Yeshua but was not conquered by Ezra, you have to separate 2 challahs. One of them is burnt, and either because of intrinsic impurity of non-Israel or because it would be difficult to protect from imported impurity. And then another one you have to give to a Kohen, either to avoid the mistake that pure challah may be burnt, because people are not aware that this part of the world is included in the that impurity, or so as not to forget that challah is given to a Cohen, purity challah is given to a Cohen. In other words, if you just take one challah and burn it, you may forget that there's a concept of giving challah to a Cohen, and that's why we have the second one to give to a Cohen. And the purity status of this Cohen in this part of the land is subject to dispute, and it's not relevant to our discussion. Okay. Then we're going to get to diaspora nowadays, but let's talk about diaspora in Talmudic times. So option one was to do two challahs, and the first one is given to a Cohen, so as not to forget that challah is given to a Cohen, and no level of purity at all is required by this Cohen. And then the second one is you burn it to avoid the mistake that impure challah may be eaten by an impure Cohen. And the option two is that you only take one challah and give it to a Cohen, but this Cohen must be pure, at least from severe impurity. In other words, he has to go to the mikveh to purify himself from a seminal emission, but no red heifer and stuff like that required. Now, so I mentioned that the Chalas Lechem is very strict, and he basically says that because nowadays we don't pay attention to whether or not we be a contract impurity because of the zivus, the azav, that on different type of emission. Therefore, basically everybody has to be, all adult males are assumed to be zavim, and most of us are not aware of all the halachas of how to think, and basically everyone is a zav. However, the other poskim are not strict about that, and certainly the Alter Rebbe is mekel, as we'll see soon. I did not see the poskim, and certainly not the Alter Rebbe, talking explicitly about women and whether or not a woman going to mikveh regularly would be enough, or we require her to go with all the additional stringencies that the Chalas Lechem has. But let's see this Alter Rebbe. Okay, all the above, this is the Alter Rebbe's in Siman Tov Nun Zayin, which is the laws of Pesach. And as we'll see later on, that even though it's customary nowadays, as we all know, that we don't usually give challah to a Kohen to eat, it was quite a prevalent minhag until fairly recently that on Pesach we did. Not the case that we're talking about on Erev Shabbos of Pesach, but that on Pesach, if you baked matzah on Pesach and you were mafresh challah, you gave it to a Kohen, and we'll see soon why. So that's why this law comes up in the laws of Pesach and Siman Tov Nun Zayin, which is the laws of baking matzah, chapter 457. And let's read this from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. This translation is taken from the Chabad Daron. I have a question?
No, I was just thinking of the commonality of this of Zav. I'm assuming it's some kind of sexual transmitted.
Oh, no, I don't know. I actually looked this up in the art scroll, and they say what it is, but there's no note of, we are not aware of this phenomenon now. I don't know. Anyway, don't forget that for a woman, nowadays we don't differentiate between nida and zava for a woman. But zava for a woman is also considered about an anomaly. It's also considered a sign of something unhealthy.
So she's bleeding more than 7 days.
It's not more than 7 days, and she's bleeding out of her cycle, basically. I mean, there's different shittas in Rishonim exactly how to. Anyway, okay. All the above applies with regard to challah separated in Yisrael, which is not eaten by Kohen in the present era, for we have all contracted ritual impurity resulting from contact with the corpse. Accordingly, the challah will have contracted ritual impurity, and thus is forbidden to be eaten even by a Kohen who's ritually impure. Therefore, it's forbidden to bake this challah on Yom Tov. Okay, that's the truth is we don't need to get into that right now. Maybe we'll get into that soon. By contrast, this is the relevant part. By contrast, challah separated in Chutz La'aretz is only forbidden to be eaten by a Kohen who is impure because of a discharge from his body, e.g., a what? Zav, yeah, that's a mistake. Zav or I see. 1 second, yeah. A Zav or one who experienced a seminal emission, whether because of forces beyond his control or willingly. However, a Kohen who is pure with regard to the impurity resulting of zivus or a seminal emission may partake of challah separated diaspora. This category includes a child who is not, a Kohen who is a child, i.e. he is younger than 9 years and a day. 9 years and a day is the halachic way of saying he's 9 years old, because on your 9th birthday, you're already into so basically be younger than his Hebrew birthday of turning 9, who does not become impure because of a seminal emission, and also can be assumed not to have experienced his other emission since he is less than 9 years old. If, however, he is known that he experiences of emission, he is impure even if he's only 1 day old. It seems like the Rebbe doesn't seem to suggest that Zav doesn't exist. Anyway, a mature Cohen, meaning a Cohen who is older than the age of 9, who experiences seminal emission, but who immersed himself in a mikvah, and this is very important, containing 40 sah of water fit for this purpose, as explained in Yerodea section 201. Now, that's very important to realize, because nowadays, strictly speaking, halachically, there's besides on Erev Yom Kippur and possibly on Erev Yom Tov, there's no obligation for men to go to mikvah. But the custom is, amongst Chassidim certainly, that we are careful. It's called Tfilas Ezra. That Ezra made a decree that a man who experienced the seminal emission, whether no difference of whether it was in a permissible or forbidden manner, even if it was because of being intimate with his wife, he should go to mikveh before studying Torah or before davening. However, for Tfilas Ezra, we're not so careful about the mikveh having all the kosher requirements that it has for a woman. And so we're not going to get into all the details now, but there's numerous things that we're careful about when we build a mikveh for women, or even when we build a mikveh to immerse utensils in, which we may not be as careful about when building a men's mikveh. But that's just in general for Tfilas Ezra. If you want to do that custom of going to the mikveh before davening after you've had a seminal emission, you don't need to have all the stringencies that it has for a woman going to mikveh after menstruating, which is a chiyuv kares. But for a Cohen to be able to eat challah, it needs to be 40 sah of water fit for this purpose, as explained in Yerodea section 201. So whereas men will sometimes even go to, in absence of a regular mikveh, may even go to mikveh in a swimming pool, which doesn't have any value for a woman, but does have value for a man to go to mikveh for Tfilas Ezra. But you wouldn't be able to eat challah if you're a Cohen after you've gone to the swimming pool.
What about a bathtub?
In theory, a bathtub could be just as well as a swimming pool. The problem is that usually a bathtub is not big enough. Meaning, an average bathtub is probably a little bit more than 40 sa'ah, but it's not going to be big enough for you to put immerse your whole body under the water. It's just going to go flooding everywhere. Even though such a Cohen did not wait, and if you have a huge jacuzzi, then might be an option. Even though such a Cohen did not wait until nightfall after his immersion, he is permitted to partake in challah separated in the diaspora. True, such a Cohen is impure due to the impurity associated with the human corpse and other types of impurity, and the challah is also impure. Nevertheless, our sages ruled leniently regarding challah separated in the diaspora, since it was instituted only to make a distinction as a remembrance, so that Jews will not forget the laws of challah, as explained in Yerodea 3:22. Therefore, if dough was designated as challah on the festive days of Pesach, okay. Now here's another halacha. It is desirable for the Cohen to be careful to eat the challah directly after immersing himself. He should not urinate between immersing himself and eating the challah, lest he release murky or cloudy urine that could possibly contain semen. So even if you have an adult Cohen who's literally just toivel in the, so if he's just toivel in the mikveh right now, and by the way, I haven't seen explicitly, when men go to mikveh, we don't do all the, we don't clean under our nails and do all the preparations that women do. So I didn't see whether that's necessary. But even if a Cohen has gone to mikveh, this morning, let's say, but we can assume that he's been to the bathroom since, so then better that he shouldn't do it. Because who knows if maybe a tiny drop of semen came out together when he urinated with his urine, and therefore the Cohen would be forbidden to partake in challah until he immerses again. Challah should not be given to any Cohen who is more than 9 years old, even though he says that he did not experience seminal emission until he immerses himself. Okay, so basically, therefore, of all the options that we've spoken about, of giving it to a wife or daughter of a Cohen, giving it to a Cohen or to the son of a Cohen, the best option is always going to be to give it to a male Cohen below the age of 9, because then you don't have any of these issues. And again, perhaps we'll talk next week about giving it to an animal belonging to a Cohen, which obviously doesn't have any of these issues. Okay, now some of you may be wondering, I never heard of giving challah to a Cohen, and I also never heard of taking 2 challahs. We only separate 1 challah, right? So, as Rabbi Absalom would say, funny you should ask. So indeed, The Rishonim already say, this is explicit in the Mishnah and in the Gemara, but hold on a second. We never heard of anyone taking more than one challah. We just do one challah. What's going on over here? And we only ever heard of taking one challah. And the Rishonim suggest various reasons. Now, some of these reasons explain, I'm going to go through them. Some of them explain only one thing. They explain why we only do one challah nowadays. And some of them explain two things. Why we only separate one challah and why do we not give it to a Cohen? Why, in other words, like this. The halacha is in Chutz La'aretz you have to do two challahs. The halacha is in Chutz La'aretz you have two options. One option is you do two challahs. One of them is burnt and one of them is given to a Cohen who's been to mikvah. To a Cohen even if he hasn't been to mikvah. And the other option is that you do one challah and you give it to a Cohen who's been to mikvah or to a Cohen who's younger than 9 years old. So nowadays the minhag is that we do one challah and that we burn it. So some of the reasons that we'll see only explain part of that, and some of the reasons explain both of those facets. Why we only do one challah and why we burn it and don't give it to a Cohen younger than 9 years old in practice. So first let's start by reading the Rosh. Okay. This is shocking. Nowadays, in most places, so even the Rosh was aware that in some places it's different. We do not separate a second challah, even if you burn the first one. Says the Rosh like this: in the times of the Amoraim, in times even as late as the times, it's very interesting. In times of the Gemara, they had the access to the ashes of the Parah Adumah, and therefore, at least in Israel, Kohanim were able to eat teruma. They were able to eat challah. You could have a Kohen who went to mikvah and waited for nightfall and had the sprinkling of the ashes, and he was 100% pure. And they were eating challah in Eretz Yisrael. And he brings a raya from the Gemara that indeed they had access to the Parah Adumah. And therefore, so long as in Israel, remember, go back to your chart. What happens in Israel? In Israel proper, you do one challah and you give it to a Kohen who is 100% pure. So long as that was happening, the Chachamim required that in Chutz La'aretz we also give challah to a Kohen in order that we not forget the mitzvah of challah. But nowadays that we don't have access to the Parah Adumah, and therefore the mitzvah of the challah as it ought to be is basically forgotten anyway, because there's no such thing as giving it in the land of Israel where the law of challah actually really applies. There's no such phenomena as giving it to a Kohen anymore. So therefore, that's why in Chutz La'aretz we only do one challah nowadays, and we don't give it to the Kohen, we just burn it, and that's the end of it. Says the Rosh, that's the justification for the prevalent practice of only doing one challah and burning it, not giving it to the Kohen. However, the Rosh finishes off, minhag tovim would be an appropriate custom that we should give another challah, we should give a challah to a Kohen. Because, on the contrary, specifically nowadays when we are not giving challah to a Cohen in Israel, there's all the more reason to give challah in Chutz La'aretz to a Cohen. Because in Israel, we can't give it to a Cohen. In Israel, in order to give it to a Cohen, you have to have the ashes of the Parah Adumah. But in Chutz La'aretz, where we have the option to give it to a Cohen, then it's even more reason to do so. Why? If you don't give challah to a Cohen anywhere, not in Chicago or in Israel, then how much more so will the mitzvah of challah be forgotten? And tomorrow the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, and nobody will remember that there's such a concept of giving challah to a Kohen. Now, here in this tour over here, the tour, it's called the tour of the Hamoy, one of the new tours, and in the footnotes, they bring an interesting svara. It says like this. So we're only doing one challah nowadays. So what do you do with that one? Do you burn it or you give it to a Kohen below 9 or a Kohen who's been to mikvah? So he says like this. If you say that the reason you have to give a second challah and give it to the Kohen in the diaspora is because we don't want people to think that you could burn pure challah. Sorry. That would not be in the diaspora. That would be in the middle section, the Mitzrayim. Yeah. So nowadays that everybody knows that everybody's impure, there's no paradum, there's no nothing. So there's no reason, nobody's going to think that you could burn pure challah. But if you say the reason is that you should, like the Rosh just said, that you shouldn't forget, that we need to give it to a Cohen, so not to forget the mitzvah of giving challah to a Cohen, so then that's why nowadays we would say you should give a challah to a Cohen. That's one explanation from the Chazon Ish. And an additional explanation is the Malay, he brings from the Malay Ha'emer. I believe the Malay Ha'emer is Eliyahu Tzunz. We have some of his from in the library. And he said, that it depends what the concern is. You see, the Rosh says the reason we just read this, that the concern is when Mashiach comes, we're going to forget that you have to give challah to the Cohen. So therefore, take challah now and give it to the Cohen. So when Mashiach comes, remember to give it to the Cohen. But some say no. The problem is that if I'm going to give the challah to the Cohen here, then before Mashiach comes, I might move to Eretz Yisrael and give it to the Cohen there, and that's not allowed. I have to burn it, and therefore we say burn it here, so that when you shouldn't by mistake, if you give it to a Kohen here, you might accidentally give it to a Kohen in Israel. So those are the different perspectives of the way to look at it. Now, what other reasons could there be not to give it to a Kohen? So the Beis Yosef brings from the Sefer HaTruma that the Beis Yosef brings from the Sefer HaTruma, you have to make sure that non-Jews or non-Kohen, non-Kohen, don't eat it. So if you have this challah that you're going to give to a Kohen, then you suddenly have this headache to make sure that not even a single crumb is going to be eaten by a non-Kohen. Whereas if you just get into the habit of nobody eats this and it's burned, so it's more, it's safer. Additionally, he says, what if you give it to the Kohen and he dips his challah into the boiling hot soup? The challah, you boil it with boiling hot soup. So now that bowl has absorbed challah. Has absorbed not challah, what we call challah, absorbed challah that is forbidden to be eaten by a non-Kohen. And then next Friday night, the non-Kohen is going to eat his soup from that bowl, and he's going to be eating the taste of challah. So that's another reason. Now the truth is that in itself is a whole question whether or not blius of tam challah and chusar is the problem, but that's the reason given by the Sefer HaTruma. Now additionally, we have here another important reason. And that is that, so the Taz and the Shach both bring this, and here there's some Jumach base, which is where the laws of Challah are discussed. And he says nowadays it's not customary to give it to a Kohen. And in the here elaborates a little bit more. Shamanis Chalalu, yeah, the Bogan of Ram brings Shamanis Chalalu Echad Mir Moisav. Maybe one of his mothers became a Chalal. And I'm going to elaborate on this in a moment. I'm just looking through here. And the Yam Shel Shlomo says, the Marshal says, nowadays we don't have proper yichus, shamanis bal, halvashal is bal zara kodesh, arkein mevim karvadish is balbalu, and therefore k'maisa liyo im halvim, and therefore we don't do it. Okay, so let's just summarize what that means. Basically, what all these reasons poskim have in common is that saying that the reason nowadays we don't give it to Kohanim is because we're not convinced that we actually legitimately know who is a kosher Kohen. And whereas in the time of the Mishnah and even in the time of the Gemara, it was close enough to the time when they were actually commonly eating trumas, maisis, korbanos, where it was easier to remember. Nevertheless, nowadays we don't have that. Now, why would it be that a Kohen is not really a Kohen? How could that happen? So the way the Marshal says it, what he seems to be saying is that we just forget. And he brings the story of Eliyahu and Malavim. I'm not 100% sure if this is what he means, but because I don't know of a story of Eliyahu with Leviim, but I do know of a story of Eliyahu with the Kohanim. It's a famous Sefer Chassidim, where he brings a very long, strange story. We've discussed it in the past, of the Rav Hagon, who used to come up every year in Nishana Rabbah and circle Harazesim on Nishana Rabbah. And Rav Hagon would meet with Eliyahu Hanavi every Nishana Rabbah. And basically, Eliyahu Hanavi told him that all of these people who are with you, who are considering themselves Kohanim, of all of them, only one of them is a legitimate Kohen. So perhaps that's the story that the Marshal is referring to. Now, why would the Cohen not be a Cohen? So what the Marshal seems to be saying is Yichus. Now, the truth is that both of the reasons that we're going to see now actually became even more prevalent nowadays with the quote-unquote Baal Tshuva movement. So one issue is Eidos. That means like this. In order to know that I'm a Cohen, it may not be good enough to just have scientific evidence. You have to have Eidos. You have to have testimony. And if the father of the Cohen is not kosher a witness, he's not a Shomer Shabbos, for example. So even though he tells his son, you are a Cohen, and then the son goes and becomes religious and he wants to duchen, he wants to be a Cohen and get the first Aliyah, it may not be good enough, because even though he may be 100% convinced and have no reason to doubt the accuracy of, he doesn't think his father's lying to him, but there may be a requirement for an actual testimony that he's a Cohen, and therefore that may not be good enough. The other reason, which the Magen Avraham, the Shach, and the Taz all bring over here, is that basically Shaman and Challah echad me'emosav, which means that even if we know 100% and we're going to accept his father's testimony that he is a son of 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 Aaron, but perhaps one of the mothers was Nischala. And the most common way of that happening was that if any of the wives, the mothers of anywhere in that lineage, had relations with a non-Jew, that would be the most common way, certainly nowadays, of that happening. So then the child is not considered Cohen. I actually personally know an individual who became a Baal Tshuva, who when he became from, initially when he started, his parents were completely secular, but his father did tell him that they're Kohanim, and in the first few years of him being from, he used to duchen. He actually lived in Israel for a while, he was duchening every day. But as he became more aware and more knowledgeable, he actually knew for a fact that before his parents got married, his mother had for many years a non-Jewish boyfriend. And so it was determined that he is not a Cohen. And in fact, he's actually today married to a woman who a Cohen would not be allowed to marry. So that is a big issue that became very relevant with, like I said, in the Baal Tshuva movement, where there were Kohanim who were becoming Baal Tshuva, and if their mother was in college in the 60s, chances are she may have spent the night with a non-Jewish person, even if it wasn't a long-term relationship. So therefore, that's why the minhag became not to give challah to a kohen. However, strictly speaking, even though the minhag is not to, strictly speaking, it is permissible. And the Ramah actually testifies in Siman Tov Zayin, in the laws of Pesach, like I alluded to before, that indeed, even though the practice was year-round not to give challah to a kohen, on Pesach they did. There was always the minhag, but on Pesach nowadays that's not the minhag either. In fact, nowadays it's almost unheard of to make matzah on Pesach. We all make the matzah before Pesach, but it used to be very common for people. They didn't have the thin matzahs that we have today. They had thick matzahs which went stale after a few hours if you didn't have a freezer. So they would bake matzah every day of Pesach. So the custom used to be to give it to a kohen. And also, sorry? Sorry?
It takes 2 years for matzah to scale.
Maybe our matzah, but not the thick. We used to have here, Yosef Rabin used to come. He had the Taimani, the thick pita bread style matzahs. And so nowadays they don't do it on Pesach nowadays, but they keep it in the freezer. But if you keep that thing out of the freezer for 24 hours, you can't eat it anymore. It's rock hard. So, and also this is the lashon of the Alter Rebbe. I didn't put the English, but it is a custom in these provinces, in these countries, not to give challah to a kohen. So it's the custom, but it's clearly not. There's no halachic. Strictly speaking, it would be permissible to give challah to a kohen in the diaspora as long as it meets the requirements that we mentioned before, which practically speaking, best to give it to a child below the age of 9. Now, before we conclude, and I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit over time here, let's just discuss some possible reasons of why there would be a difference between Pesach and year-round. Why would we say that year-round we don't give the challah to a kohen, and on Pesach we do? So the Magen Avraham brings the reason. So what he means is like this. The Gemara says a story that it's talking about whether there's numerous gifts that people have to give to a Cohen, the tithes, the this, the that, the section of the shechted animals. So the Gemara is talking about the virtue of the Kohanim who were quiet about it and kept to themselves and waited until they were offered to be given these gifts, versus the Gargaronim, the fressers, who went and grabbed as much as they could. So the Gemara says over there, that with the exception of Erev Yom Kippur, on Erev Yom Kippur, even the very pious Kohanim would make a deal about making sure that they got some of the gifts to the Kohen, in order to establish that it be known that I am a legitimate Kohen. If all they're trying to do is to confirm or establish their kahuna status, so why do they have to go and take the jaw of the animal, which is one of the gifts, and let them just duchen? And the Gemara answers, we're talking about Kohanim who, for whatever reason, were in a position that they were not able to duchen. Now, Rashi says, one second, Toysa says that on Erev Yom Kippur, there was lots of meat to go around. There was lots of animals being shechted, and therefore every animal you have to give those royal l'chayim v'keva to the Kohen, which nowadays is not practiced. That's a topic of another class. But basically, because there was so much to go around, if a Kohen didn't partake in it, that would so every year round, if you don't partake in it, you're okay. You happen not to get any. But in Erev Yom Kippur, if you didn't take any, then that would almost be saying like, oh, you're not a Kohen. So that's what the Magen Avraham says, that because on Pesach there's so much matzah going around, I guess people are baking a lot of matzah, so if you wouldn't give any challah to the Kohen, even then, that would lead to the idea that people not thinking that you're not a Kohen. So that's how the minhag developed, that on Pesach you do give challah to the Kohen. And we'll finish off today's class. Two more things. First of all, I found another. You could see that all the poskim mutzazich, they're all struggling with what's up with this minhag. Why we not? Why? What's the difference between Pesach and year round? If the minhag is not to give challah to a kohen, then you don't give challah to a kohen. Why should there be a difference on Pesach? The Chalas Lechem comes up with a beautiful reason. He says like this: on Pesach, on Yom Tov, first let's talk about Yom Tov, not Cholamayit. On Yom Tov, you're only allowed to bake bread. Again, just preface that this is just, he doesn't even say this. This is just a historic fact that you need to know, that it was specifically on Pesach where they had this issue with, they had to bake matzah on Pesach. On Sukkot, you didn't have to bake challah. You didn't. Two things. First of all, on Sukkot, you didn't have to make challah on Sukkot because you have chametz bread lasts a lot longer. Again, if you're not talking about cracker matzah, you're talking about thick bread with no yeast in it, it doesn't last as long. That's A. B, on Sukkot, you have the option of Eichel and Mashayr. That means on Sukkot, you can make a big dough, and theoretically, you could be mafresh, you could leave some of the dough to be mafresh challah from after Yom Tov, and bake only the dough that you're going to eat. On Pesach, you can't do that, because if you leave dough, it's going to become chametz, right? But the other problem is that you could only bake, on Yom Tov, you're only allowed to bake Eichel Nefesh. You're only allowed to bake that which you're going to eat, right? You can't bake for after Yom Tov, and you can't bake for something that you're not going to eat. So if I'm if I'm going to make matzah on Pesach, and I want to bake all of it, but after I've baked it, I'm going to be mafresh challah. I'm not going to get into all the details of this because it's just too big of a concept, but I think it's a beautiful thing, beautiful chap that he has over here. Says, if I'm going to bake all the challah on Pesach, so I'm going to bake all the matzah, and then I'm going to be mafresh challah from the baked matzah, as we do. So the minhag is you don't give it to a kohen. So I'm going to burn that one. So that means that I baked matzah that was not for being eaten. So how are you allowed to do that? So the answer is hoyel. The answer is that because when I put the matzah in the oven, there wasn't a designated one that I'm going to be mafresh challah from, and any one of the ones in the oven has the theoretical possibility of being eaten, and it's only after they were baked that I'm koyel Hashem and making it challah. and then I'm not allowed to eat it, then I'm going to burn it. So because when I'm doing the act of putting them in the oven, they all have the theoretical possibility of being eaten. So therefore, it's allowed. Says the Chalas Lechem, this concept of hoyel, we only rely on that when we absolutely have to. But ideally, you only want to bake things on Yom Tov that you're actually going to eat. So he says the minhag not to give challah to a Cohen is a minhag that whatever we don't really know. It's sort of the minhag developed, and post facto we're trying to justify the minhag. So we say, because maybe we don't really know who's a Cohen and whatever. But halachically, strictly speaking, there's absolutely no issue to give a challah to a Cohen. Therefore, he said the minhag became that on Yom Tov of Pesach, when you bake matzah, instead of having to rely on this hoyel that every matzah has the theoretical possibility of being eaten, no, actually give it to the Kohen to eat, to a child Kohen below the age of 9, and then you're not doing hoyel, then you're actually baking something which you're going to eat on Pesach, and that's fine. And then he finishes off, and it's reasonable to suggest that because all the challahs of the matzah that he baked on Yom Tov were given to the Kohen, so then it's sort of naturally extended to being on Chol Hamoed as well, because most of the matzah that you bake is on Yom Tov for the Seder and for Lechem Mishnah, for Sudas Yom Tov. You bake a little bit on Chol Hamoed as well, and therefore, once the minhag became that on Yom Tov of Pesach you actually give it to a Kohen, so to circumvent having to rely on this halachic mechanism of Hoyel. Therefore, the minhag became that all the matzah, even on Chol Hamoed, is also given to a Kohen, and like we've established, that there's absolutely no chashash, and that's how the minhag came, and I thought this was a beautiful chap. Now, just to finish off with one point, and then so we're going to finish off now with the halachas of Kohen eating challah, and then next week we're going to elaborate on the ins and outs of the halachas of separating challah on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, and hopefully we'll conclude about about this story that we started off with the challah on Shabbos of Erev Pesach. The Rambam says in the end of Hilchos Trumas, chapter 15, halacha 25, Kol ha'oichel truma. Anyone who eats truma, first you make the bracha on that food. In other words, hamoitzi, mezainis, whatever the bracha on that food is. And afterwards he makes the bracha, similar to the bracha on Duchening, and commanded us to eat truma. This is what we received the re'ina, and we saw even in challah in the diaspora, which is not technically speaking a biblical mitzvah, nevertheless we have seen that that's the bracha that is made. What's the mitzvah? There's no obligation to eat challah. The mitzvah is to separate challah. No, it is a mitzvah because it's like avodah. Eating challah for a kohen to eat one of the kohen, the Torah, Hashem gives the kohen a gift. One of the gifts is the challah. For a kohen to eat that gift is compared to avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. Avodah in the Beis Hamikdash is obviously a mitzvah. Shenamar, as the pasuk says, avodas matona etenes kunaschem, that I'm going to give you the priestly gift, which is avodah, which is a service in the temple. And indeed, this halacha is passed in Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah in Yeridea says, Siman Shulchan Beis Yivei, ha'ochel challah, somebody who eats challah, right? Well, we've discussed whether it was on Pesach or year-round, strictly speaking, a Kohen either below the age of 9 or if he's been to mikveh, like all the requirements we discussed, may eat challah. Even in Chutz La'aretz, first makes the bracha on the food, and then he makes the bracha asher kedushanu b'kedushasei shalarin v'tzivonu lechel truma. So I don't know if my friend in this story actually did this bracha or not, but here would have been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for this hopefully 8-year-old nephew of his to have made this bracha. We'll conclude over here and looking forward to continue the discussion next Sunday.
I'm trying to figure out what's the issue that you started this year with, that story. What are the issues exactly?
There's two issues in the story we started off with. There's two issues. One issue is it permissible to give challah to a kohen nowadays, which we've by now clearly established that even though it's unheard of practically speaking, and nowadays nobody does it even on Pesach, but strictly speaking, it's perfectly permissible. And the other, that's what we covered today. The other issue, which we're going to cover next week, is that you're not allowed to be mafresh challah on Shabbos because of Misak and Mona.
He wasn't concerned about burning, right?
You can't burn it. It's Shabbos.
Right. But was that the issue, or was it that you can't be mafresh?
Well, both. You can't be mafresh it, and you can't leave it because it's coming Pesach and it's chametz. So what do you do? Okay, to be continued.
Right, because you can't be misaken and you can't be.